Hi there. I'm Angela Lewis from the Sacred Inclusion Network. And if you'd like to know more about the network, please visit our website, sacredinclusion.com. And I'm here today with my friend and colleague, William Bill Kelly. He prefers to be known as Bill, who, among other things, has a PhD from the University of New Mexico in cross-cultural studies. He's the author of a book called A New World Arising, and a book about Japan, which is called what, Bill?
Reinventing Japan, facing the West and creating new selves.
Thank you. Forthcoming. And we're here to talk mostly about Japan. How you doing, Bill?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on.
So I know that you went to Japan for the first time in the 1970s, and perhaps much to your surprise, you were welcomed with open arms, and and obviously you learned a lot about Japan. But I wonder, what was your first impression, especially given this welcome that you got?
Um, well, I was very pleasantly surprised at first because I had never been treated that way. Being in the United States, I was just one of over 200 million and didn't stand out in any way. And then suddenly, when I'm in Japan, in Tokyo, um, there are certain groups of people that wanted to know me and wanted to hire me to teach English and wanted to, um, they just showed a lot of interest in me and treated me very well. And I was given lots of opportunities. So this was a pleasant surprise. And I was very grateful. Yeah.
Yeah, just on a personal note, I met Bill in the 1980s, and I was traveling in Japan. I wasn't traveling, I was in Japan for a little while. And Bill had integrated himself with all these kind of like high-level thinkers, especially in the Tokyo region, that I got to meet. And he introduced me to a part of Japan I would have never got to meet. And we've been friends. We've been friends ever since. We were probably friends before then. So getting back to the book, or getting to the book, the thing which you point out in the book is that Japan really went through an enormous transformation in a very short time. Um, as you put it, it took the West centuries to go from feudalism to modernity. Um, what made Japan uniquely capable of making this transformation?
Well, on the one hand, they had no choice. Uh, So it was do or die, make or break. Now, why were they able to do it relatively smoothly?
Wait a minute, before you get to that, why was it make or break?
Because Japan was able to preserve its independence. So unless it modernized very, very quickly, it was going to be taken over by the Western imperialists, which is what they did in most of the world, and Japan would have been colonized. So to preserve their independence, they had to modernize so quickly. Now, so did a lot of other parts of the world, but they weren't able to do so. Okay, Japan is has a somewhat better record in that regard, and the reason I think is that Japan has always been a peripheral nation and surrounded uh, by China, for example, in its earlier history, and much of its culture came from China. So the Chinese influence enabled Japan to strengthen itself and to become much more developed in many different ways. So Japan had a history of already taking in foreign culture and integrating it into its society. So they were not so, let's say, shocked when the Western imperialists came and started making demands that they open the country and trade with them. Um, they realized fairly quickly that they did have a choice. they could welcome the West and take in Western science and technology, strengthen themselves, and preserve their independence. So they decided that they were going to do that without hesitation, whereas other countries uh, didn't find it that easy to open their gates to the Western influence. Some of them were just taken over. They were colonized. They didn't have the strength to resist it all. And others, like China, that had a history of being a central nation, in the Middle Kingdom, they thought that they could preserve more of their traditional ways and didn't have to open up to the degree that Japan did.
Now, I have a theory about this myself, and you can refute it if you like. There's something about the Japanese language, which seems to me they're able to retain their Japaneseness. At the same time, they can integrate things a little bit more easily than other languages. Is that the case? And maybe you can explain that if it is the case.
That's very complicated because I have to be closely familiar with other languages, and the only other languages I'm fluent in are French, which is a Romance language, so a very different uh, thing, and then Indonesian, which is a trade language. So that's also something very different. So I cannot really compare the Japanese language with other non-Western languages in that regard. I'm
Well, for
just not.
example, they use the essentially the Chinese script, and there's also kind of a Japanese script, and that's mirrored in language and to a certain extent. Um, in any event, that's just my theory.
Yeah, I had not heard that before, so I can't really evaluate it yet.
But you think that they were able to do this rapid modernization much faster than a place like China or other
Yes,
places, and
yes.
what are the reasons for that?
I said because it had this history
They
of being a
had to.
peripheral nation that had experience of importing much foreign culture and then integrating it and strengthening itself as a result.
Well, one of the things you talk about in the book is you identify these sort of, I guess, transitional patterns. Um, and you talk about initial adaptation in terms of Western influence, then backlash, then renewed engagement. And you illustrate in the book that this happened during the Meiji period, the ultra-nationalist era, and also the post-war economic miracle. Is this pattern repeating today in Japan, or what do you see?
Well, the point I make in the book actually is that the way I see history going is that it's no longer going to be a world divided between, say, center and periphery. Uh, that the what some have called the MetaCrisis is going to be so severe that the nations of the world are either going to come together and cooperate, or humanity, I don't think, will survive. So this is an imperative.
I want to get to the what you call the meta crisis in a minute, but I do want to talk about this particular transition that Japan is going
So
through.
that's what I'm trying to get at. Okay,
Okay.
now because of this meta crisis, what's going to happen is that all of the nations of the world are going to start to cooperate out of necessity. So the older patterns where you have a central nation and a peripheral nation, the peripheral nation then tries to find out what the secret of the success of the central nation is, and then integrate as much of that, into its own culture. That will no longer be possible because we're going to have now um, maximum exchange among nations that are becoming more and more equal. We're not going to have a clear center anymore, even though some people think that China will take that role. I don't think so.
So we mentioned this word meta crisis. You might as well define what you mean by that.
Well, it's a series of interrelated crises. we're all familiar with the various components of them. Uh, we've had the threat of nuclear war since 1945, and we've had the inability of our moral sensibilities to keep up with our technological capacities. We have the so-called climate crisis. So it doesn't look like we're going to be able to deal with this successfully. So we're facing severe environmental, ecological disruption. Um, we're facing a crisis of meaning that more and more people are feeling somewhat lost in this modern world. Part of it is the decline and breakdown of community. So people don't feel like they have a secure sense of belonging. I could go on. I mean, there are some other aspects. And what's very distinctive about the meta-crisis is that uh, it's not like we, the people, are talking about a crisis which is out there, outside of ourselves. We are part of the crisis. In other words, the world that is so-called out there is a reflection of who we are inside. And there's no real separation of the two. So to deal with the meta crisis and to even understand it, you have to include the world and consciousness, the individuals, or the groups, people. That's the meta crisis.
Okay, so let's, if we can tie that back to Japan's experience.
Right.
Perhaps they have something unique to add to the solution to this meta crisis. Perhaps not, but what is your sense?
Um, Here's one thing that they have learned, which I think is useful. Um, they modernized very rapidly, okay, and then tried to become the top dog themselves, and that effort failed with World War II. Um, and then they made another effort to become the leading economic power, and that effort also failed. Okay, that was at the end of the 1980s. So what has happened is that now Japan has really given up that what shall we call it, that hungry spirit that is trying to dominate the rest of the world to make up for having been a peripheral nation, having been pushed around by the stronger nations, and being told that your culture is inferior and all of these things. So to compensate for that, usually a nation then tries to become the top dog themselves. Now, Japan has gone through that twice already. Uh, it doesn't look like there's any way they can do that again. So their energies have been concentrated more on popular culture, soft power. So Japanese are very well liked today. That's a great contrast with, let's say, the 1980s. And
True in China.
yeah, so they are able to influence others through soft power, and that is a good lesson to switch from hard power to soft power, and to learn to be satisfied with that, and to give up that quest for ultimate power over others.
Well, as you know, Japan is very close to China, and some of the transformation that you're talking about, rapid modernization, is still happening in China today. So I'm wondering, how would you address the difference between these two transformations? And well,
Well, the Chinese transformation in some ways has been even more rapid. Okay. Um, so therefore, the psychological ramifications are going to be more severe. That's to be expected. the what you might even call the resulting neurosis from the past and the future like coming together in such a collision. Okay, now there's a huge difference though between China and Japan in terms of their experiences in relation to the West. Uh, China has been able to develop great military strength. Uh, Japan was not able to do that before World War II to anywhere the same degree that China has now. And then in the 1980s, Japan's developed economic strength, but did not develop great military strength. They did not try to become the leading military power. In fact, the United States was providing their security. Okay, so that's a huge difference. So that means that the United States was able to stop Japan because it had a lot of leverage over Japan, providing its security. And that was one of the reasons why the Japanese economy went down. See, but with China, it's a different story. The US does not have that ability. And what's going to happen is that it's going to be a fairly equal contest. And if it's fought to the bitter end, they're both going to lose, and humanity as a whole is going to lose big time. So this collision between the West and China is far more severe than the collision that took place in the 1980s between the West and Japan. And its negative consequences are much, much worse.
Well, we should let's jump out and talk big picture for a moment. In your book, you talk about in your first book, you talk about one of the principal dynamics we need to really understand is that various cultures have had a reaction to Western dominance, let's call it. Japan has had one particular type of reaction. China's had another type of reaction. Islam's had another type of reaction. India's had another type of reaction. So all these nations and cultures have had to react to the influence of the West. And maybe if we generalize and talk about all these types of reactions, what characteristics would you say unite all these different cultures in terms of their reaction to the West? What have they had to do to sort of survive and adapt?
Well, they were all forced to develop kind of fractured cultures and fractured identities, and they all had to deal then with the psychological fallout of that, which has been very severe. The other thing is that they have all been challenged then to preserve their own unique selves and to maintain the sense that they are not just being swallowed up by the West and they are not losing their essence, because they tend to, all of these nations and civilizations have tended to believe like they had some kind of essence which is different from that of the West. So that's what they want to preserve, is that essence. And they've all had to find ways of doing that then, while modernizing to such a degree that essence was severely threatened and actually changed in many ways. And they have all had great difficulty in admitting the extent of the change. And a lot of times when they do admit it, then they say, oh, all the Western influence is bad, and we've got to keep it out completely. But it's already there. It's already come in. So you can't get rid of it. That's an impossibility. So they're all dealing with that issue, which I think is huge, and which the West doesn't have to deal with. So that's why the West doesn't understand the rest.
Hmm.
That's the biggest difference. It's not culture, it's history.
Ah. So give me a few examples of the sort of like the psychological shock that we could talk about China, we talk about Japan. Just talk about maybe those two. You talk about a kind of a identity crisis, if you will, between the Western influence and the essence. Um, so
Yeah.
maybe give some examples in both of those different cultures.
Well, I mean, the clear example in Japan was after Japan opened the country and decided to become a modern nation, 1868, Meiji period. Um, then for about 20 years, there was a time called civilization and enlightenment, in which they didn't just import Western science and technology. They tried to import just about everything, even ballroom dancing, and then eating meat, and just an enormous number of things were taken over. Even Christianity was seen as like somehow the secret to being powerful. The West had Christianity, so Japan was going to have to come up with an equivalent. Yeah, uh, and then in the reaction, they did come up with the equivalent, which was the emperor system. And that became a very destructive pattern ultimately that helped to create the conditions for World War II. So the reaction then against the West and taking in everything from the West became the affirmation of Japan's unique identity. Its essence is the emperor who is divine, you see. So this, now, for most of us, okay, in the 20th century, this is the early 20th century, for a modern nation to create something like the emperor system and believe the emperor is divine, it's like, wow, were these people crazy or what got into them? No, my answer is no, they weren't crazy at all. This was the this reveals the extent of the dislocation, of the shock, of the neurosis, of the fractured identity, that these extreme measures were taken. And it's understandable if you have studied the history. It makes perfect sense to
Let
me.
me just back up and make sure I understand you. So you're saying basically, as a result of the shock of Western influence, um, Japan needed to reassert itself and find its cultural identity, and it did so in a way that we might consider pathological, which is the emperor system. Is that essentially what you're saying?
Yes, yes.
What's the parallel in terms of China?
Oh, okay. Maoism is the parallel where um, Mao Zedong was willing to send in Chinese troops in the Korean War, even though the U.S. had all of this air power and it's such overwhelming technological superiority. Okay, a million Chinese troops died as a result of fighting in South Korea. But Mao said, "Look, no matter how strong you are, we will never give in to you, and you are just a paper tiger. Even your nuclear weapons, it's a paper tiger." So there was this extreme assertion of Chinese identity and superiority and uniqueness and cutting China off from the world, um, except for the Soviet Union and then the Third World. Okay, so again, for some people in the West, God, Maoism, that's pathological. No, it's not at all. Makes perfect sense under the circumstances. And of course, there was a pathological fear in the West of communism. So the West did not make it any easier for China to find its way. And the same thing happened with the West and Japan. The West was very racist and discriminatory and did not appreciate Japan's successes. So it made it very difficult then for Japan also to come to some kind of rapprochement, some kind of agreement. Same thing for China in the Mao period. And the only way that the West will accept these non-Western nations is if they say that they're going to become more like us.
Mm.
You see, then we'll accept them. So in the 1980s, the idea was that Japan was becoming a capitalist country just like the United States. And therefore, we could accept them and we were providing the security. So it was a great um, setup. However, when Japan's economy started getting so strong and American industries were being decimated, then the tide turned and a lot of commentators then began calling Japan the new enemy. And it's the same with China then. China goes through the reform period after Mao's death, and it says, yes, we're going to become capitalist, and we're going to become part of the world trade system and all of this. And Americans think, great, because we can send our businessmen in there and make lots of profits. And okay, but then when it seems like no, China is not becoming an imitation of the United States. Actually, it's trying to become stronger than the United States and gain more influence in the United States, especially at the U.S. expense. Then they become the enemy. So right now we have a new Cold War, and China is the enemy. It's if you understand the history, it makes a lot of sense.
Well, it's interesting. And one of the things that we should probably talk about a little bit is that not just the influence of the West. Well, yes, the influence is there, but on the other hand, we're relatively blind to these kind of things. We have not been colonized, at least, not in the same way. So we don't see this. Talk about this sort of myopia that we have.
Well, I don't think it's so different from any other nation or civilization when they are supreme. The tendency is to think that, well, we have all the answers, so we don't have to understand the experiences of others because they will just do things our way. We are obviously more prosperous. We are more powerful. We have what they want. They don't have anything that we want except maybe their natural resources, stuff like that. But at a higher civilizational level, they really have nothing to offer us. So that's the thinking, and it's not strange that this is how Western civilization, and more recently, especially the United States, has turned out to have this kind of what you call myopia. But it's again, it's very understandable given the circumstances that, let's say, the United States was in after World War I, and especially after World War II.
At the same time, when you talk about Japan, and this is also true about China, there is this sort of soft power that influences America. I think particularly like back in the 60s and 70s, there is this interest in Buddhism, for example, that came into the United States.
Yes.
And similar type of dynamics in terms of interest in China, So you talked a little bit about soft power in relationship to Japan. How is soft power influencing us, meaning United States people, if at all?
What I think happens is that this is an irony. Like especially white people in the United States um, tend to feel like, in one sense, they don't really have a culture. They are the most powerful group. They're the dominant group economically and politically. But yet, culturally, somehow, it's those more peripheral groups, those others that have the really interesting cultures, the exciting cultures, the dynamic cultures, the ethnic cultures. So the ethnic food, the ethnic music, the ethnic arts. So they all start to attract the dominant group. And I see this again as something not unique to just the United States. I think it's happened before.
Well, in regard to the United States, what you're talking, it's true with the sort of like the especially the white attraction to all things black,
Yes,
cultural
yes,
black. It's
yes,
like, you can go in certain places of the South. All you can hear country music, but you can also hear a lot of race music, a lot of like blues, rhythm and blues. I've been shocked to go to places. Actually, this happened in Japan, but there was a number. I was in a dojo, and there was an English guy that knew more about black music than I did. He knew more about the black music in Philadelphia than I did, and I'm from Philadelphia. This shocked me. But it's the truth. It's like, here's a sort of a subjugated, you could call it, group of people, and their culture influences the dominant culture. In very, to some extent, it looks bizarre from my side, from my person of color vantage point.
Well, yeah, I would just point out, though, that when you're in a subjugated or oppressed group, you see, then you don't have the same opportunities that the dominant group has, and therefore you might not get as much education, and you might not go into those areas which are more left hemisphere and which, you know, make you unbalanced in certain ways. So there's still a celebration of more of the emotional side of life, which has been lost among the dominant group because of its pursuit of power. So this they can find in the oppressed group, and it's very, very attractive because a lot of people in the dominant group, they want to stay in power, but at the same time they feel a certain kind of emptiness, and they think that ah, these people, like the black people, they have something that I want.
Not just the ability to pick cotton for us, but
Right, right, right. That's right. Yeah, yeah.
wow. Um, so I guess we could talk about Japan forever, but it's really mostly about the meta crisis and how we're going to deal with it. So
Uh,
you posit that a lot of aspects, what we're calling the meta crisis is it's a hydra with many different elements.
right.
It confronts not just any nation, but it confronts us as humanity.
Yes.
So maybe this is a big question, but what do the lessons of history tell us in terms of what we might need to do next to be able to survive and at some point thrive?
Wow. Unfortunately, I think this is unprecedented, actually. Um, and because of the advance of technology and communication systems, we're in a situation now where we're all in contact with each other, and we're able to um, cooperate at a global level, at a planetary level. We're able to do that. Um, but in terms of our consciousness, we have not yet developed uh, that capacity. And what I'm saying basically is that uh, this meta crisis is so severe and it threatens us as a species that we're going to have to go through what are totally unprecedented changes. Um, so some like, Aurobindo even talked about, almost like creating a new human. It at this next level of evolution, that's what it's going to take. So, in that sense, I would say history doesn't tell us a lot because in the past, what we learned from history is that there were always these religions, or now we might even call spiritual traditions that that emerged, but they never got to the point where the majority of people adopted them. It was always a small minority. Okay. So we see that. Now what's going to happen is for the first time, many people, not just a small minority, are going to have to become religious or spiritual in that sense, at this higher level. Um, and if that doesn't occur, then I don't think our chances are very good. But I do believe that once it starts to happen, it builds up a certain momentum, and then the social and cultural changes will feed into the personal changes.
Well, this word that you use, which is an important word to pick apart a little bit, you talk about religious and spiritual, and that's a long conversation which we don't have time to get into. But it seems to me that there's a growing secularization of society in all these places that we're talking about. You know, United States is maybe less so, but actually, it's a global phenomena. But I guess my point is that it seems that religion is declining. Science is on the uptick. You can almost call science almost sort of a new religion, shall we say? Um, so it's like it's useful to be clear about that because I don't think what you're saying is that religion is going to save us.
Well, I'm saying spirituality will, in the sense that the meta crisis requires, first of all, the acknowledgement that we are the problem and that our consciousness has to um, be further developed. Or, another way of putting it is that we have to come in contact with our human essence and discover what that is. And if we don't do that, then we're in big trouble. What I'm saying then is that um, treating it as a problem external to ourselves and using engineering, technological solutions is not going to cut it this time. Uh, it won't work.
When you
So,
when you say we are the problem, you mean not just cultures and societies, we as individuals.
well, I mean, it goes back to consciousness. So what I'm saying is that, culture too is a product of consciousness, and then the larger society, you know, is influenced by culture, but ultimately that's by consciousness then that it's being influenced.
So, do you see, and maybe this is my attempt to end this on a positive note. Do you see any evidence that this transformation of consciousness is happening on perhaps a smaller scale than is necessary?
Yeah, well, I would say that just in the United States, and this is in parts of the rest of the world as well, but I know the United States better. I would say that, yeah, since the 1960s, uh, there has been greater interest in spirituality, and as you mentioned, Buddhist influences come in. So of course, have influences from Hinduism and Taoism and Sufism and other what we might call religions or spiritual traditions or wisdom traditions. Okay, so I mean that is clearly um, a shift. I'm not saying this never happened before in the West, but to the degree, the extent to which we see this um, is, as I think, unprecedented. However, um, it so far is taking place at a rather shallow level, and therefore we're not seeing the social transformations that come about from uh, an evolution of consciousness. We're seeing some signs that people are interested in, acknowledging the issues and developing themselves in this direction. But in terms of results, it hasn't been impressive so far. So that's why in the social dimension, we don't really see much change yet.
I think we see pockets. You mentioned Orobendo's communities, for example. There are communities like that pretty much all over the place. It's a very sort of nascent kind of thing. There is no thing that happens that connects all these different elements, I'll call it, progressive elements.
Yeah, yeah. But the only thing that connects them is that really they're saying the same thing
Yes,
in many different ways.
yes, they
And they
are.
recognize the need that we have. I think they would all agree that without this self-inquiry, without this, say, revelation of who we are, um, we're in very big trouble. I think they would all agree on that.
So you have a number of other projects that are in the works. Maybe you should say a little bit more about them. So I know that the book about Japan is forthcoming. The book about China, I'll put in the show notes, the name and how people can get it. But what else are you working on?
Well, the book on China, I'm still working on. I'm revising it right now. I'm calling it tentatively Reinventing China, um, from the century of humiliation to the new Middle Kingdom. Okay. It's a parallel to the Japan book. I mean, I'm making basically the same points, but showing the experience that China has and where it's likely to lead, versus the experiences that Japan had. Um, okay. Then the other things, I mean, I've written an autobiography that was about almost 10 years ago. I may revise that eventually if I'm still alive. Um, I also wrote a book about African American literature and what white people can learn from it and how it has enriched me. Um, that would need a fair amount of revision and some editing. So again, if I'm still here, I maybe I will do that. That's about it.
Well, Bill, this is it's been a enriching conversation for me, and again, I will put references and resources in the show notes. And Bill Kelly also has a website. I don't remember where it is, but
No, no, I no longer do.
well, he doesn't have it anymore. Anyway,
But I'm switching to now. I'm starting to use Substack, so we'll see what happens there. And I'm already on Medium. I have over 100 articles on Medium. Yeah.
well, fantastic. I certainly I don't have the energy to read all of them, but I personally am enriched by your presence, and I hope some of the people that listen to this will do the same thing I am in terms of following you and what you're talking about. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much. I really appreciate having this opportunity. Yeah.